So I think it's time we get started. So let's start. Welcome everyone to our last SAMF talk for this semester until summer break. Please, stay tuned to our website. We're working on the next seminar lineup starting in the fall. Today we're very happy to have Tai-Wei Hu here from University of Bristol presenting Breaking Up with M. It's an hour talk with questions. So panelists feel free to unmute just like a normal seminar, ask questions as you have them. If you're an attendee, you can ask a question through the Q&A, and I'll try to be moderating that and interrupting Tai-Wei as we go. But without further ado, Tai-Wei, take it away. And we'll have 15 minutes after the talk for further discussion.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for being here. It's really great. So the paper is with Guillaume Rochito, and let me tell you what the paper is about. So the paper is going to be about a theory paper, hopefully not surprisingly. We're going to do a thought experiment. And the reason we want to do a thought experiment is that we feel this kind of thing probably a good idea to do field experiment. But here is the experiment we'd like to do. We'd like to think about an economy that's almost cashless. This is a picture that Guillaume took in a local restaurant in Irvine. Cash seemed to become quantitatively negligible in many economies. Our question is simply, in that kind of situation, if we eliminate cash, would there be any welfare consequences? So before we dive into theory, I'm going to give you a sense that, how,
Tai-Wei, I have a comment already.
yeah, sure.
You mean eliminate paper.
Yes, I'm going to mean
Paying
paper
with the
currency.
paying with the debit card is the same as money.
I'm going to say now model that's going to be different and going to be
Okay.
very different. And hopefully when you see the model, we can have that discussion, or I'm happy to clarify depending on you, Randy. Let me move on. So in terms of observation, here's one measure of cash use, as Randy just asked about. This is about paper currency. When you look at cash in circulation, there are a lot of heterogeneity across countries, but notably there are some countries like Sweden look like very cashless. However, people argue, not us, people who work on empirical work, that cash withdrawal may be a better measure. And according to this measure, as you can see from the picture, it looked like many economies, especially the advanced ones, are progressing toward cashlessness. If you dive in toward United States, and here become a relevant question, what kind of other alternative payment instrument people are using in terms of number of transactions people using different payment instruments look like debit cards, especially credit cards, seem to be quite dominant. In terms of value, things are slightly different because the big items, sorry, like rent, usually paid by, say, the red debit in this country or bank direct transfer. So that's the online payments will be one of the biggest, but credit and debit cards are still big. And in the US, there's always small amount of check. But by this measure, cash has become very little. It's less than 10% in 2015. It's going to be less than 4% in 2024. So it looked like cash has become quite negligible in many economies. Theoretically, there's already big debate long time ago about, in 1996, actually, Woodford gave a panelist talk during Society of Economic Dynamics conference and presented a paper and argued that when M becomes small quantitatively, it is also irrelevant and we can do without cash in our models, even when we want to discuss monetary policy. And as you know, that has a whole generation of macroeconomists following this route. Until recently, Lagos also gave an SCD talk and argue alternative view where even though you are around the cashless limit, cash can still be relevant. And in that paper, a prominent role being played in order for these to hold is that financial intermediaries have market power. Now, this sort of question turns out not just have theoretical relevance, it seems that government cares a lot about them too. In particular, even Sweden, the country arguably the most cashless, if you wish, having an initiative from the Ministry of Finance called Cash Inquiry, and which proposed that business have to maintain the ability to accept cash. More broadly in Europe, actually, the core has ruled that cash should, in principle, be accepted, and different countries have argued or show the enthusiasm that they want to make sure cash is a viable means of payment. Even in the United States, which is more decentralized in Philadelphia, just recently has passed a law that says that retail businesses have to accept cash. And the central concern behind all this initiative are what people call financial inclusion. But one question is this the only concern governments should have? That's sort of the background. To address these questions, we're going to take a slightly different angle from the literature. We're going to propose a model that has both the coexistence of both outside money, or think about literally as paper currency, and obviously as we go along, spiritual, then we have a nice discussion what cash really means. But along with alternative means of payment, which we will call inside money, that could be both credit and debit cards. As you will see in our model, the most straightforward interpretation of model will be credit cards, but I will argue as we go along that we can have equally valid interpretation as debit card. So that would be the way we're going to go. But the most straightforward interpretation will be credit card. And we're going to do this by
But
introducing.
Tai-Wei, I have to interrupt again. Credit cards and debit cards are very, very different instruments. Debit cards are the same as checks, just an electronic version. Checks are the same as cash, except your banker holds on to it for safekeeping.
I
So
agree that, yeah, go on.
I was going to say if you have to make a split in our aggregation, I would say cash, debit cards, checks, stored value cards. Those are all the same. And the key defining characteristic is you have to work to get purchasing power first, then you consume. Credit cards, like any other credit instrument, you get to consume now and pay later.
So I agree that part of distinction, but I want to argue for our purposes, it's more about through which you are able to use a means of payment. I'm going to argue that for both credit and debit cards, it's through the financial intermediaries that give you the power to use a means of payment, while cash you don't. And that kind of power is going to be important for the relevance of cash when cash is more or less not used anymore. So I agree there are other distinctions which can be important, and we're not touching those. Instead, we're looking at the
Okay.
outside option part from the financial intermediary. That would be more like our focus. Does that make sense?
I'll say provisionally, maybe.
Okay, thank you.
Tai-Wei, quickly, there's a question in the chat similar to the question I had. What about, how do you think about reserves, either interest paying or zero interest paying reserves? It's the same as money, outside money?
No, so I would say for our purpose, we're going to think about only what people can use in their transactions. So in that sense, we're not going to model that part of banking sector where they deposit money in central bank and so on.
So
That'll be the
CBDC would be, yeah.
so CBDC potentially could become our cash, and that I prefer to talk about later when we see the model. Because one part of the talk, I think an important thing we try to draw out the paper is what characteristics of cash make it relevant and make it have welfare difference, and in what way. And I think we can have a discussion about different features of CBDC. For example, it could potentially have some record keeping aspect that cash can never have. I mean, paper currency can never have, and that'll be relevant for some of the results. If you can be patient, I'll probably have some discussion about that later on. If not, feel free to interrupt me. Is that okay? Cool. So we're going to focus on two elements that's going to be important. One's a limited convenient. It's very good that Nobu is here. According to Nobu, that if you want any theory of money, you better begin with this friction. And another thing will be important, especially when we talk about financial inclusion, is that we're going to have heterogeneous liquidity needs. That's going to be important for us to have an endogenous determination of who using cash and who going to use inside money or financial intermediary service to get means of payment. And that's going to be two mechanisms, broadly speaking, that's going to be important distinction for us to get different results that we get the relevance of cash. One way is that there's a costly enforcement so that people, if the Society of Financial Intermediaries are willing to pay some cost, that's going to perfectly enforce repayment of the consumers. Another one is public record keeping, where there's no such coercion power, but reinforcement repayment, is enforced by reputational reasons. And I'm going to think about different structures of the credit market in terms of banking relationship and think about different results. Let me give you the main finding. Let me remind you the main experiment is an environment that was using cash but become nearly cashless. And think about what would happen in an alternative environment, everything else is the same, but there's no cash. What would happen? First, if we have external enforcement and banks have no market power, we're going to restore Woodford's view that cash is irrelevant in this case. Once we move away from that world, particularly when bank have market power or public record keeping, then we're going to have relevance. But how cash is relevant going to depend on different credit market structure. First of all, when banks have positive bargaining power, which is a form of market power, then we'll get distributional result in the sense that cash can be used as an outside option that's going to affect how banks and consumers split the gain from trade by using banks' means of payment. Aggregate welfare is not going to change if it's only bargaining power, but aggregate welfare will be affected when we have privately informed consumers about their own liquidity needs. In that case, that restrain the bank's market power in terms of information friction. In that case, the welfare will fall when you remove cash, and that's due to more people will be financially excluded in the sense that using the bank services because banks like to screen consumers and without this upside option allow them to do more credit rationing. To some extent, some bottom consumers will be excluded altogether. That implies a non-monotonicity in terms of how welfare change relative to market power of the bank. Really depend on the source of the market power. If you wish, when consumers have private information, that limits or decrease the bank's market power a little bit, but that also changes welfare in a non-monotonic way. Finally, although the literature, meaning Lagos and Zhang, find that removing cash is bad when banks have market power, we find that we can have welfare gain from removing cash because in a self-enforcing reputational war, when you allow cash to be used or as an outside option, that increases the temptation of consumers to default and hence lower the credit limit. So that in that way, you get welfare gain instead of welfare loss. So that's sort of the overview of our findings. Any question?
Yes, I do, Tai-Wei. So why cash is removed in the model, or what is the reason you have in mind?
So you mean
I'm thinking cash is not using anymore is endogenous response from the
correct?
consumer because there are newer payment technology. So that might correlate it with the financial intermediation development. So rather than exogenous gift, maybe the answer whether the welfare improve or not depends on the reason why cash is removed. I'm just wondering.
So I think the sort of answer will be two fronts. One is theoretically, we want to understand if you do away with cash altogether in models, would that matter? Will your welfare implication, will your allocation be changed? So that part is theoretical. In terms of policy, I guess a question, and that's related to what I said earlier about government do try to do things one or the other, whether you want to let these things go, and then in particular you allow or directly promote no cash payment, or basically say that cash is no longer a legal tender, or you can go another direction, which many governments do, that they proactively saying that no, 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 cash has to be accepted somehow one or another. So I think that does have policy implications in what we do in a war that people don't seem to use cash anymore, and it's not completely free to run a cash system. So you may wonder whether we need to do that. And another angle, which already we had a little bit CBDC or other electronic payment, sort of, or electronic, I should say, cryptocurrency war, in what kind of sense should we regulate or do we should disallow that, and what kind of things should we allow disallow? I think the paper has also something to say about that. Would that make sense, Mike?
I think, yeah, maybe let's talk more later. It seems like now cash is removed come from the supply side. I'm just wondering
No,
maybe
no, we will
cash is
have
not
that.
used from the.
No, in the model we'll have that, but the question is, do we allow that? And which will be sort of important in our setup with the government um really maintain the credibility of the cash use through, keeping the inflation or keeping the rate of return money as reasonable, and that will be some parameter we're going to have. I do think that's sort of an active thing. It's not like government can completely be inactive and just let it go. They're going to have some kind of policy stance to some extent, I think. So maybe let's talk and we'll see model
Thank
as
you.
well. No, thank you. So let me skip the literature a bit. I just want to mention money as an outside option is not a new idea. Many papers, and I'm sure many of you here actually, Jonathan in particular, and many others have contributed, and Zach and paper with Guillaume. So this is not a new idea. What's new here is we really think about cashless limit in different ways, in different sort of mechanism, imperfection, the credit market, how would that affect the relevance of cash, and obviously related to money and credit. I'm sure we're going to have more to talk about that when we see the model. Let me give you the environment. So we're going to have a model of both money and credit. So the model is going to be somehow resembling the alternating endowment model of Townsend, but also for tractability, also introduce a lot of elements of a new monetarism model as well. But here is the environment times discrete. They're going to two-stage in each period. We'll think about tau equal 1, 2. There's one consumption good traded, and all the trades except for relationship with bank is going to be competitive. They're going to two types of non-financial agents of equal measure. All of them like to eat every single stage. None of them like to work, but not all of them have the ability to work, which will come next slide. Let me first give you the important thing about the heterogeneity in terms of the preference, which will determine the liquidity needs. So the preference or the utility function from consumption in stage is multiplied by a parameter epsilon. As will become clear next slide, type 1, I'm going to call them buyers. Only their epsilon in stage 1 matters, which will be distributed according to f of epsilon, while other epsilon are not very relevant in what we do, so we're going to normalize them to 1. So whenever I mention epsilon, it's going to be about stage 1 type 1 bias preferences. And we're going to assume for most of the talk that epsilon is constant over time. It's not super important, but it's useful. So that's the preferences. Now let me give you the endowment pattern. So the two types of agents, non-financial agents, have different endowment in terms of labor supply. So type 1, naming buyers, have no endowment in stage 1, hence they are buyers, while they're going to have endowment in stage 2. While type 2 agents, in contrast, will have endowments in both stages, stage 1 and 2. So they can always produce, hence it's going to be nature that buyers need to buy from sellers in stage 1 and with the liquidity needs. And this is going to be the new monetary tradition. The labor supply or labor cost enters utility function linearly. And whenever you have endowment on your labor, the constraint H less equal to H bar never binds in equilibrium. So that's going to be for tractability reason. So let me emphasize again, in stage one, only sellers have labor and buyer need to eat, and the only way they get is get stuff from or buying from sellers. While in stage two, everybody can produce. Question? So that's an environment. What's going to be important, and that's going to be about how we think about the credit market or inside money. There's a unimeasure banks. They have linear utilities in consumptions. Buyers can obtain loans from these guys in the OTC market, so matching will be one-on-one. And by the banks going to issue their IOU in exchange of buyer's IOU, and only bank's IOU can be accepted by the seller, as you can see from this picture. So the basic idea is that banks give the buyer IOU and they owe the bank, while buyers can use their IOU to get stuff from seller. This is essentially what we do in our credit card transactions. When I go to my local Tesco, they don't recognize my IOU, they only recognize HSBC's IOU. And whenever I do that, I essentially owe HSBC money. And in stage two, the buyer going to repay the bank and the bank is going to repay the seller. It's going to be inconvenient to track two kinds of IOUs in the economy with different prices. So one equivalent formulation which we adopt is that the bank buyer's IOU going to be guaranteed by the bank and in exchange of an intermediation fee. So there will be only one IOU in the model, and the bank and the consumer are going to bargain for intermediation fee. In principle, you can redo the model. Instead of having credit, you can think about bank have to invest in some liquid asset and using that liquid asset to back the buyer's deposits, and you can do the same thing. What's important for us is that even with that equivalent formulation, the buyer still have to negotiate with the bank and the intermediation part, and the use of cash as an outside option, and this inside money is more important for us. So for us, we're going to group both debit card and credit card as the same instrument as we think of the IOU here. So here's a banking relationship that's going to form. We're going to assume it's a long-term relationship in period 0 through 1-to-1 matching. Bank going to incur two kind of costs for commitment and monitoring. Think of the fixed cost in terms of commitment technology, and that's going to pay in per period terms here, going to pay K units of goods. And there's a variable cost as well. You think about a long size of D, the bank also have to pay sigma D. This K, as what Michael was saying earlier, is going to be very important to determine who have access to the banking sector and who's going to just use cash. And we're going to think about the change in K as endogenous driving the cashlessness in the economy. Banks and buyers going to negotiate bilaterally for the amount of the loan or debt limit and the fee. They're going to bargain in a generalized Nash bargaining fashion. And of course, if the joint surplus is negative, they're not going to be bank. So that's going to be the total environment. Any question? Good. So there's outside money. It's going to be support.
Tai-Wei, can I ask you?
Yeah.
But I mean, here inside money and outside money are going to be equivalent because banks can always commit, right? In general, banks cannot completely commit, and the government instead can commit. So outside money and inside money are not going to be equivalent from that point of view.
So let me clarify. So here, as you said, I think when you say inside, outside, you mean debit card and credit card. Yes, we're going to say them equivalent because bank can commit. Here, with outside money, we mean this slide, the fiat money supplied by the government. And second, we can, in principle, having bank also have a limited commitment problem. We actually do it in appendix in the paper, and the result will not be different really. But it's going to be more complicated, obviously, because think about how much rent they need in order to keep them, honest and so on and so forth. So we do have a version of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
No, thank you. And nice to see you, Fabrizio.
Hi.
So the outside money, yeah. So money we're going to model as simple as can be, grow at a constant rate. Then there is an opportunity cost of holding money. You have Fisher equation. I would just be the nominal interest rate of an illiquid asset, which we don't have in the model, but if you have, that will be the interest rate, and nominal interest rate will be opportunity cost for buyer to hold money. We're going to make the assumption that sigma is lower than I, and hence there are private interests of these agents to issue credit instead of using holding money. And the one thing that's going to stop them is going to be the fixed cost K. That's going to be the model.
Hey, Tai-Wei, can I ask you
Yes.
something?
Yeah, Louis, of course.
So, so I can think that what you're defining as cash then is just any asset with no limited commitment issues and the constant real rate of return, like this, because I is exogenous here, huh? Not just
Yes, I
common,
is
right?
exogenous here. Yes. So I'm
Okay.
thinking about Sigma as technology, enforcement technology. I'm only interested in economies where this kind of enforcement technology is relatively low. I'm
Could be
not
like
really
bit,
thinking about.
could be like bitcoins, for instance.
Say it again?
Could be like a bitcoins.
You mean this Sigma thing? No,
No,
I
the
would.
I, because there's no
Yeah, I can
limited.
think about.
The
Yeah,
I
you can.
guy, yeah.
Yeah, I can think about speak. Yeah, so for now, I won't think about really government issue fiat currency. Yeah, but for most of the purposes, especially when thinking about outside option, yeah, I can think about that as Bitcoin. So I think the part of the value I will argue is that from our analysis, hopefully it can be clear to see when cash is useful and why. I think that why part is important. So hopefully you'll see if you
Yeah,
can wait
thank
for
you.
quite a few slides, but if you can wait for that, we're going to see that. Yeah. So here's the equilibrium. Right. So we're going to, because we have this two-stage thing, so it's also a bit of new monetary transition. We're going to have two value functions. W going to be agent value function from stage 2 on, and V will be agent value function from stage 1 on. So we're going to begin our analysis backwards from stage 2 on. So in stage 2, the value function depend on the wealth that agent bring into stage 2. That will be real balance and amount of IOU they hold from other people. So here B positive meaning that they hold positive amount bonds or IOU issued by others. When B is negative meaning that they had issued that in stage 1. The bond limit going to be more macro-ish if you wish. So B lower bar will be the minimum amount of bond holding you will have, which typically will be negative, mean that you can borrow up to negative B lower bar. So these are relevant for stage 1, but they're relevant for stage 2 because stage 2 also depends on stage 1 value, obviously. This is the usual budget constraint. Here RM2 is the rate of real balance from stage 2 to following period stage 1. If you plug in and we have the assumption that H bar doesn't matter, remember, does not bind, remember that everybody can produce in stage 2. We got a familiar new monetarist stage 2 value functions linear in wealth, and the optimal consumption will just maximize. Remember, epsilon here is normalized to 1, UC minus C, and don't worry about the subsequent one, which will become clear next slide. So that's stage 2, rather standard. Now we go to the stage 1, which is more important when thinking about liquidity. In stage 1, the value depends on how much money the guy hold from stage 2 in previous period. If it's a buyer, his epsilon and his debt limit maximize his instantaneous utility consumption minus labor cost plus the value going to the stage 2. Again, RB1 and RM1 are the rate of return from stage 2 in previous period to from stage 1 to stage 2, and H and M are labor and money that you already have at hand. Because in equilibrium, if we want sellers to accept both money and bonds as means of payment with positive amount, it must imply that the both rate of return has to equal to 1 due to stationarity, which you assume that rate of money across periods must be equal to 1 over 1 plus pi, and Rm1 equal 1 imply Rm2 is 1 over 1 plus pi. And you can simplify the value function for the buyer. Then you got this expression. Now we're going to use d epsilon as a type epsilon that limit how much you can borrow up to. Recall that the guy cannot produce, so how much you can eat really depend on the liquidity at hand, which will be real balance he hold. And as Randy mentioned, this way he can issue liquidity or issue credit as much as he can up to the epsilon. So this will be a total liquidity, and how much you're going to eat going to determine by how much he has up hand, and it will be the minimum between the optimal one unconstrained, which will solve this optimal condition relative to the total liquidity at hand. So that will be the stage 1 value function. After we know that, we can go back to buyer's optimal money holding problem. Remember, the rate of return money is 1 over 1 plus pi. That's why we have this term here. And the guy has value of money depending on how much relaxed his liquidity constraint in stage 1. So we're going to solve this maximization problem. When you simplify, you got the opportunity cost of holding money as a negative term, in which the cost, while the benefit coming from increase in a trade surplus the type epsilon buyer may get. There are 2 important sort of threshold I'd like you to remember. One is this thing that when in a hypothetical world where the buyer has no debt limit at all, so this d epsilon equal to 0 or below by equal 0, that will be the optimal money holding, just solving this without this term. If your d epsilon is greater or equal to than this amount, then you don't want to hold any money because it doesn't add any trade surplus for you anyway. Otherwise, you're going to supplement your debt limit by amount that get you to what you will get without any debt limit, as this equation is saying. So that's going to be useful for you to remember. Any question? Okay. So this is going to be very important for our purpose. They tell us how much our buyer gain by having access to this inside money. And then later on we'll talk about how they split the surplus and so on and so forth. Of course, there's a cost of using the service that's going to come up. But let's just look at from buyer's perspective. So the difference is a guy with debt limit d epsilon from a guy without any debt limit 0. On the left-hand side, you have the picture when this d epsilon is not big, namely less than equal to what he would get if you just use money amount alone in terms of liquidity. In that case, the optimal choice of consumption will not change. So what the debt or this credit card buys him is basically saving the opportunity cost of holding respective money. So ID epsilon is going to be the per period difference he get out of having this banking relationship. Otherwise, he will actually get a higher trade surplus because he have more liquidity in total when d epsilon is greater than this MC epsilon. So the difference in trade surplus, what he get in credit and what he get in money, will be the gain from the banking relationship. So that's going to be that. So to remember, easy to remember, when d is low, the is linear in that d, only saving opportunity cost, otherwise become concave because saving, so the more trade, getting more trade surplus as well.
Tai-Wei, can I ask you something?
Yeah, sure.
In our paper with Chow and Randy, we have that limit is irrelevant, right? It doesn't really matter very much. You can accomplish everything with money. You have the same thing here, or?
So it's going to be similar. That's why when d is less than equal to MC epsilon, what is saved is just opportunity cost of holding money. It doesn't change the aggregate. It doesn't change the trade surplus. But when d epsilon is larger, in that case, it's going to matter. What's going to be different from your work, which is very important work, is that we have a heterogeneity. So this trade surplus and whether how much you gain from the banking relationship will depend on epsilon. And that's going to be very important. That's going to determine some people use cash, some people don't use cash. And that's sort of where we depart from your work. And here it's going to be useful.
So
Yeah, we know that corner solutions cause problems for that. And your guys who don't use cash are at a corner solution, right?
So what will happen is some people just use cash, some people never use cash. So
Right.
that's going to depend. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Now, Guillaume and I have a paper which responds to Postlewaite's comment. He says he never uses cash, so inflation's irrelevant. But that's like saying I never take Uber, I take a taxi, so I don't care if they get rid of Uber. It's missing the general equilibrium effects. The people who use cash is endogenous, and the higher inflation rate, the more people will use cash, which could potentially affect you know what I mean. Maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, here we're keeping eye constant, but sure, I mean, our threshold would depend on inflation. There will be endogenous response. You'll see in a second. Yeah.
Yeah.
So can I ask a question about the banking relationship? Maybe you're going to get to it in a minute, but they're going to be a distribution of these fees with your heterogeneity?
Can I just go to this slide?
Oh yeah, okay, all right.
Yeah, so that's spot on. So that's how we determine the fee. So the buyer surplus will be, so the contract will determine two things: D, the debt limit, and the fee, how much the buyer pays to the bank. And the buyer surplus will be what they gain from the banking relationship minus a fee, while the bank has to pay the variable and fixed costs. Just remind you, they have to pay all that. And the debt limit is going to be heterogeneous, obviously, because you know how much they need is different. But remember, because in this world, sigma is less than I, so in optimal contract, whoever is banned no longer going to use cash, so we just maximize the trade surplus from the debt alone minus the variable cost. The fixed cost doesn't matter for the intensive margin. To answer Alan's question, fees, of course, also depend on epsilon. In fact, in general, the higher the epsilon, you pay more just because you get more as well. And the fee has to cover the monitoring cost, variable plus fixed, plus the theta fraction, which is a bargaining power of the bank, if you wish, and times the increase in joint surplus. That depends on the trade surplus you gain from using credit minus the cost, but also minus the outside option the buyer can have. Namely, remember in our expression for G, that also depends on what you can get by using cash alone. And that's going to be important. So when this is positive, meaning cash is used by other people, even though I don't use it, the fact that I can use it going to change my fee. So that's going to be heterogeneous and real. Yes, Alan?
Okay, so this kind of sets up my question. So then this is when you eliminate cash or you do basically anything here, you're going to have a selection effect on the buyers because they vary by this epsilon. But
Yes,
your
correct.
banks are all the same, right?
Say it again?
Your
K is
banks
all the
are all
same,
the
correct. K
So
is
there'll
all
be
the
no
same.
selection effect on the bank side, right?
No, here we're not super in, yeah, but we're thinking,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, yeah, fine, yeah, no, yeah, sure, yeah. Okay, so financial inclusion has been pointed out. What's important going to be this K, determine who use cash and who going to use the credit. So we're going to define the epsilon R as a critical type, where this difference going to be equal to K, where the first term is how much you get using cash, second term is how much you get by using money. When this term is greater than K, you have positive joint surplus. When it's less than N, you don't. And this term in our setup with all the usual assumptions, it's increasing in I and decreasing in K. Importantly, and as we're going to think about cashless limit, as K go to 0, that going back to Michael's earlier point, epsilon R going to 0 mean that everybody going to use credit without cash. All right, so
in your
yes,
economy,
Noble.
like in your economy, if inflation is high and then nominal interest rate is high, more people are using credit.
Correct.
Yeah, but usually the country which has a high inflation also messed up in credit system. No? So like say Argentine, people use less credit and try to use the cash fast, and hyperinflation destroy the credit system often, not stimulating the credit system. No?
So that's a good point, an interesting point, which I don't have a very good answer on top of my head directly. But the one thing I will say is that also depend on the underlying limited commitment. No, I mean there's a lot of things going on when you have those sort of situations. Not just inflation just go up, it's also credibility of many things, including bank, may also go down, I think. But that part obviously we abstract away. But of course, there are. I think my quick answer would be the other things were not captured in that word. But this is a observation we should remember, though. Thank you, Noble. Cool. So let me go on. So monetary equilibrium. So for all I positive, there's a unique steady state monetary equilibrium. For K small, money and credit coexist, as you can see from this picture. For epsilon below epsilon r, people using money. For epsilon above epsilon r, people are going to use credit. And the aggregate real balance is going to be held only by excluded buyers. Let me go to, because of time, I have to. Yes, Russell?
I'm just wondering, bank is special here because bank also can observe epsilon. Is there any rule from that
No,
assumption?
so later on, we're going to have private information. If you give me time, I will show you what happened when private information of epsilon is. Yeah, no, that's important. That's going to be very important, yes. So let me define cashless limit. We're going to think about sequence of economies indexed by Kn, and each one has a real balance is Mn. And we're going to say the limit is cashless if equilibrium real balances go to zero as n go to infinity. And here's a simple lemma. You already have conjecture as Kn go to zero is the only possibility we can have a cashless limit in this economy. So that's kind of like what Michael's earlier point here. Our idea is that technology driving this commitment cost go to zero, and that's why the cashless limit obtained. Here's a proposition about both irrelevance and relevance. So think about a limit of cashless limit with a sequence of economy where Kn drive to zero. Consider alternative economy where there's no cash to begin with whatsoever. So first of all, if theta equals zero, meaning that the bank have no bargaining power, then there's nothing change in these two economies. When theta is positive, aggregate welfare is not going to be changed even in that case. However, there's a distributional relevance of cash. If the bank do have positive, strictly positive bargaining power, then buyers are worse off because their fee is going to increase with theta because more of the joint surplus will go to the bank. And that's the only relevance of cash up to now. And so because of time, let me not go too much into the competitive search. Let me instead go to what Russell just asked about the private information world. So up to now, everything is complete information. And in this world, we have irrelevance as is to the aggregate welfare. Things going to change when buyer type is private information. And this is going to be a source of market power. In that way, it's well known from micro theory work that was important due to incentive connectability in the screening problem. It's no longer the type epsilon, but the virtual valuation, essentially epsilon minus the inverse, the reciprocal, the hazard rate. And we're going to assume V of these virtual variation going to be increasing as well as V of epsilon divided by epsilon. We're going to think about to make things relatively simple, to be tractable, the bank, and they have all the pricing power, but they don't have full market power because of the private information. They're going to offer a menu of contracts that's going to specify intentionally for each epsilon what their limit and what fine or what amount of fee they want to charge. But of course, buyer going to choose voluntarily one of those items from the venue. One thing that's slightly unconventional is that we're going to also have a bunch of buyers the bank intend not to serve. That's because there's a presence of a K. There will be buyer which is not profitable for the bank to do that. So that's going to be the what we're going to have. it turns out, despite bunch unconventional stuff, including the fact that there is a moral hazard issue to some extent because the buyers can choose amount of money on top of whatever they offer from the bank, we can solve the problem in a relatively tractable way. The problem become the following maximization problem. There are two things to choose. One is the threshold above which I want to serve, below which buyers I don't want to serve. The second one is a sequence of the epsilon for each type of buyer, which will also in equilibrium determine how much fee I want to charge. And if you look at this expression, if we replace virtual variation by epsilon, the first three terms will be how much joint surplus will be from the contract for epsilon buyer. And the last term is sort of the outside option the buyer can have. So if there's no incentive compatibility or individual rationality problem, we just maximize this statically epsilon by epsilon. But because of incentive compatibility, buyer have to voluntarily choose which one. We have to replace V epsilon by V epsilon. Moreover, we still have IR problem, individual rationality, which may imply bunching at the bottom of the thing. It turns out we can replace that IR condition, which is fairly complicated, with a single condition that we're going to always offer a contract that has higher debt limit than what they would get with money alone. This is coming from the fact that I is greater than sigma, then we can prove it's always optimal for bank to offer something that buyers would never voluntarily choose to supplement their liquidity with money. So that's going to be a fairly tractable problem. The solution to the problem has two regions for case small, which is the case we're interested in. First of all, the threshold is determined by a simple equation for low liquidity guys. Might be easier to begin with that, namely there's a card of epsilon tilde. What the banks offer is going to mimic what they will get in cash. So the IR constraint is going to be binding. Their pay will be exactly the same as they will get if they use cash. But it's beneficial for the bank because sigma is less than I, so the fee will be just charging opportunity cost they will have, and the amount liquidity solving how much they will get if they use money alone. And those were the guys where IR constraint binding. For higher liquidity guys, the IR constraint is no longer binding, and the first of the condition for the debt limit will solve similar to what you would have without the IC problem, but replacing epsilon by V of epsilon to respect the IC, and the fee will increase with the epsilon as well. And we also obtain cashless limit as Kn go to 0, real balance go to 0, and everybody serve. So here is the optimal contract, how it look like. Essentially, there will be at the very bottom, it's not served by the bank, but that go to 0 as Kn go to 0. Low liquidity guys, IR is binding, they get similar liquidity as cash. Higher liquidity guys get a higher debt limit, but also get charged higher fee. So here's a proposition to compare the cashless limit against a no cash economy. So at the cashless limit, if you remove cash, aggregate welfare falls. In fact, the epsilon going to fall for a positive fraction of buyers. Moreover, there will be more financial exclusion when you remove cash. So that's a world where almost nobody use cash, but because a bank, in a no cash economy, the IR become much easier. I can just offer you nothing, and you will be the outside option for the buyer is no liquidity at all. So D epsilon greater 0 will be the IR constraint. And because of that, they're going to really take advantage of higher liquidity guys. And you can see from this picture, this red line will be the debt limit that offered to in a no cash economy. At the bottom, the IR will be binding, and this guy will not be served. And the reason is I want to make sure the higher guys, I can charge more fees. And in order for me to do that, I want to make sure that they don't want to mimic the low type low liquidity type guy. And the way to do it is to make that as low as possible, namely 0. In contrast, in the cashless limit, although cash is not really used, but the fact that it can be still used as an outside option, discipline bank's decision optimal contract. And in that case, what the bank will do is that here for these guys, although II is binding, the bank has to offer something for them. That also limits how much they can charge for the higher guys. And hence, in the cashless limit, when you remove cash, all buyers are worse off because phi epsilon is higher for everybody in the no cash economy whenever they are banked. So that's going to be the implication. So let me recap. What we're saying is that in a world where cash is negligible, when you remove cash, there will be more financial exclusion. The bank, because they want to have a higher fee, they are going to not offer a bunch of people services. And there will be more credit rationing, the debt limit will be lower, and everybody's worse off. So just quick review of what we learned so far, and hopefully I have 10 minutes about public record keeping. So you think about market power, not just bargaining power. Too extreme is when banks have no market power, in that case, no bargaining power. In that case, the near cashless economy, no cash economy, both have the same aggregate welfare, the same as complete information when bank has all the market power, no information friction. However, when you allow private information of buyers that decrease bank's market power, you're going to have a difference between the two, and you're going to have a loss for the aggregate as well as for the buyers as well. So that's going to be the non-monotonicity I mentioned earlier. If there's no question, let me move to the second type to mitigate the limited commitment by public record keeping. And I will comment on earlier question about bank. What if they are also limited commitment? So here we're going to have a record keeping technology that allow banks to access buyers' credit histories. They cannot enforce loan repayment. And for simplicity, we're going to assume sigma equals 0. And we're going to interpret K as a fixed cost of using this record keeping technology. This is going to be Keyhole-Levin type of self-enforcement in terms of reputational incentive. So the left-hand side is the same picture, but in stage 2, the buyer now can choose to default. And the only way to punish the default is telling everybody this is a defaulting guy, and people will not lend to them in the future. And because of that, we're going to change how the relationship is formed and involved. We're going to assume every single period there will be a negotiation in the Nash bargaining between banks and buyer. So in stage 2, they're going to negotiate a fee, and the loan amount going to determine endogenously, and the buyer going to receive the loan from the bank. And in stage 2, they decide to repay, and the bank have to pay the cost K. Even though with this difference, a lot of value function carry on through previous analysis. In particular, the fee determined by Nash solution will have a similar thing as before. Remember, sigma is 0. So it's simpler. So it's going to be equal to K the cost plus the increasing joint surplus times theta to the bank. And hence, we can calculate how much the gain from credit trade for a buyer going to be 1 minus theta times the maximum between this joint increase surplus and 0. Sorry, so here's the right slide. So the debt limit determined by incentive compatibility to repay. So these are familiar equation. Many of you have done something very similar. We're going to have D epsilon is the amount of temptation you may not want to repay. We remove rho from the left-hand side from the right-hand side to the left-hand side to make it easier. This is per period gain from having the credit access. And one thing that's different is that typically we have something like the red curve here. We begin with 0 here because the existing K. We're going to shift the right-hand side curve down by a margin of 1 minus theta K. That imply with the usual assumption of concavity, generally you're going to have 2 intersections. You will always pick the larger one. And you're going to have a unique monetary equilibrium if and only if rho is not too high, so that the slope of here is not too high, so rho is not too big, so that they have intersection. For K small, money and credit going to coexist. I'm going to have cashless limit if, again, as before, when Kn go to 0, real balances will go to 0, and the threshold for banking agents going to go to 0 as well. So everybody going to bank in this world. Now, in this world, the welfare implication is going to be different. So consider again the cashless limit. First of all, we like rho to be something in between. For rho too small, with or without cash, you always get first best, and hence cash is irrelevant. So we want rho not to be too low. And you don't want rho to be too high so that you have coexistence and credit is going. So when you have in between, removing cash going to have a positive aggregate welfare, which is very intuitive because in this world, when you remove cash, what happens is that give less temptation for the buyer to default. And hence that allow the debt limit to be higher, and hence that's going to be useful. One thing
I have you might not know, there's a paper by Iagari and Williamson in Jet long ago, which has a similar result. The Keel-Levine credit limit is less tight the higher is inflation, because once you get kicked out of the credit system, you got to use cash. If inflation's high, that's a harsher punishment. An extreme version of that is there is no cash. Once you get kicked out of the credit regime, you have no option.
I agree. So we're doing.
I'm just giving the historical reference. Gary Williamson.
Thank you, Randy. So we have something, I don't know where they have it, is a distributional effect is still there. So although the aggregate welfare is better by having no cash, we find a range of rows in which buyers are worse off. And the reason is simple, even though you remove this temptation and you can have a higher debt limit, but it also lowers buyers' bargaining position. And the welfare is going to be different for them as well because they're going to have paid the higher fee, even though that is higher. So we still have the distributional effect. So we have both in this economy. And incidentally, relative Lagos, I like to emphasize, there they need banks or financial intermediary to have positive market power for cash to be relevant. Here we don't. And back to earlier point, here we can also handle if bank has limited commitment, then bank would need again the bargaining power in order for things to be sustained. But we have similar result there as well, so we can do that. We actually do that in a. Okay, great. Any other question? So also here I'd like to say a few words about CBDC and sort of what kind of cash we're talking about. When you think about CBDC, especially in relation to this kind of result, one thing you could potentially do, and what's very important for our mechanism, as what Randy mentioned, other people have done, is that when you use cash, there's no way I can punish you because you defaulted before. With CBDC and other government-issued digital currencies, it can be used as outside option, but may still maintain the fact that, or may have the new feature that when you have defaulted in financial sector, the government may still track you and limit your use of CBDC or other ways to punish you. So that will make a difference from paper currency per se. That will be harder to do. Okay, great. So let me conclude. So here we answer a question: what are the welfare consequences of removing cash from economy that already nearly cashless? And our answer is nuanced. It can be unaffected, it can increase or it can decrease depending upon the underlying mechanism, how society mitigates limited commitment, depend on what the sources of the market power, whether it's coming from information or bargaining, and the market structure, the credit sector that determine the bargaining power. And one thing we learn from this is that market power is not necessary for relevance of cash. And removing cash, the other thing that's we think is new is that removing cash can generate financial exclusion. So that's sort of the thing that we think you might learn from what we have done. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Okay,
That's
great.
quite good. We finished exactly on time.
Yeah, good timing. Did you practice?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Okay, great.
So we can take now open questions. If you're a panelist, feel free to unmute. There was a few questions in the chat and the Q&A that we didn't have time for during the talk, but if you want to ask those live, just use the raise hand feature and I can unmute you and you can ask your question.
Okay, Tai-Wei, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
That's actually not a question, but a comment that's related to Russell's previous question. I think that's a very good one. So it really depends on where does this cash limit come from, right? Why the economy becomes more cashless? Here, somehow you have a technology improvement that K goes to zero, and people get to choose whether they become banked or not banked, or whether they get credit or not. And in Lagos Zhang, they have that alpha probability, whether you get excluded or not. There isn't such a choice out there. So I think in general, my comment is also result could depend on what's causing the cashless limit. Which limit are you taking? I think that's sort of important. It's good to flesh out. That's my comment.
No, thank you. I agree. I mean, I think I would prefer having an endogenous determination, and also relate to what's been said earlier, that there are some underlying parameter that we can interpret as technology, and people can free to choose different payments. I think there are models like Lagos Zone that's more like, if you're in this fraction, you can only use cash or not. I think I prefer this one, but I certainly agree with you. How you do that endogeneity would have implications. That's certainly true. We take a particular stance. For us, we think it's natural. There can be other things, and we are definitely open to that. And I think it's more about our point. Our point is not saying, oh, cash must be relevant in this way or that way. Our point is more about, it really depends on how you endogenize or think about the underlying environment, and depend on that. And we hope this sort of a relative nature and not complete off-the-shelf, but close to off-the-shelf models that people use, and we look at the implications. I think that's more of our view. But I think the point is very important that, yeah, it really depends on how you endogenize this cashless limit get in. Yeah.
Yeah, I have another thing to say, another remark. You mentioned at the end CBDC.
Yeah.
So I don't know any good paper that tells you why CBDC is different from paper money. But here's the paper that could do it. When Maliko wrote his quantitative, his numerical paper, he was looking at the welfare cost of inflation, but he couldn't run the Friedman rule because people can run out of money. So how can you possibly tax people? In Lagos, right, you can do it because you just work to get the money to pay your taxes. You can't do it in Maliko. So you might say you want to not use lump sum taxes, but get a deflation by taxing people as a function of their money balances. You can't do that with currency because you can hide currency. Once it's CBDC, you could impose taxes which are contingent on your money holdings, and then you could run a deflation and go beyond what Maliko did. Someone should write that paper.
Very good. Thank you, Randy.
One question, informational frictions
Yes.
model. I don't quite understand, but the epsilon is
Sure.
constant over time, right?
Yes, epsilon.
Individuals. And then the bankers match is at the beginning of the period or
Correct.
sequence. So
we're thinking about relative simplified version. So banker and buyer meet in the very beginning of the war.
Yeah.
And that's where the private information occur.
Yeah, but
they
then
commit.
there are some incentive for the unserved customer. Say next period, some bank said, since you haven't served, I can give you the different deals. So there are some kind of free entry if you allow.
No, so we
Then
don't allow
it
that.
might
It's
have
very
some sort
important.
of the durable goods monopoly style limitation of monopoly power of the bank. So at some point the bank's monopoly power is limited because of the bank has a temptation to serve for the unserved customers. So is there any possibility like that?
So
Mm.
okay, so let me answer what we do in the paper and let me say
Yeah,
what could be done and what I
yeah,
think. So I certainly agree what's super important is that once they negotiate, the bank
yeah,
commit to
yeah,
that particular
yeah,
arrangement. That's
yeah,
super important.
yeah,
Because obviously if they can learn what you are, not just the
yeah,
unserved, right? But even
yeah,
who you
yeah,
are, I may want to change the
yeah.
terms and extra more and things like that.
Uh-huh.
So that
Yeah,
potentially could have we exclude that. Uh,
uh-huh.
so ideally, if you want one
Uh.
defense we can have is instead of having permanent type, you could have type randomly draw to prevent
Ah, okay, okay.
landing.
Then you cannot have a durable.
But as a theory guy, I would say
Yeah,
a more satisfactory, the most satisfactory, which you would not do in this paper, I think already too
yeah,
much, is
yeah,
allow banks some to learn and think the dynamic
yeah, yeah,
contracting.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
going to
yeah.
be
I see, I see.
very
Yeah,
complicated, which will go
yeah.
way
You
beyond.
don't want to go too much.
I don't want to go too much there. I think we just want to make simple point, but that point is well taken. I completely
Mm-hmm.
agree. I think it's an
Okay,
important
okay.
point, but it's going to be beyond this paper. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I have a question, or I guess it's a question or a comment, because I'm not sure if it maps into what you got or not. We could imagine a situation where some of these buyers have limited access to banks, like they have high search costs or something, so they're continually getting screwed over. And so in this case, banking market power can allow kind of inefficient issuers of payment instruments to exist, and the cash outcome could discipline that. Is that, I'm not sure to what extent that's captured in your setting with different types of, with different bargaining outcomes with this epsilon. That's like, I'm thinking of like selection along the side of the financial intermediaries. Cash, cuts off the high cost guys, something like that.
So I think you might have two ingredients. One is maybe there's some heterogeneous K of some sort, heterogeneous
Well, yeah,
clause.
that would be a mechanical way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be one. But let me tell you what we actually do in the paper and some are along the line, but not exactly. So let me tell you, this is this slide. One thing we think is important is endogenous this theta. For now, theta is taken as given, exogenous. One way to do that is to have a competitive search framework where bank just enter, say again, in the very beginning, they enter, they have to pay, K can be interpreted as a fixed cost of doing that, and they post contracts and buyer can search, and they just search for these contracts. In that world, we can show as the entry costs go to zero, you do get cashless limit, and that's the only way you can get cashless limit, and now will cash become irrelevant under that world. And of course, you can have other imperfections and other things, but that will be somehow related. One thing one can think of is, so this is one way you can think about, so the outside option, but obviously there are many other ways you can think about different outside options if you wish, and screening. So we kind of keep it simple and sort of close to known models. But yeah, I think there's a lot to be done and interesting thing you can think about from here.
Tai-Wei, I have a little technical question about this monitoring technology.
Yeah, sure.
So in Townsend's paper, the banks monitor borrowers only when they default, but in your setup, banks just monitor all the borrowers in the economy, and it's an increasing function of the loan size, right? So I
Yep.
was thinking of how to justify this cost function that is increasing with the loan size, because from the bank's point of view, if you have two different borrowers, right? So I don't see how this this cost can be different across different borrowers depending on the loan size. Do you have any reasonable
So
justification for
the
that?
way
Yeah.
we think about it, first of all, I mean, we are not exactly using I think when you mentioned Townsend, you have in my costly state verification models. Yeah, I also work on those models. So this is kind of more broader and more reduced form, if you wish. We don't exactly model the monitoring sort of process. It's more natural to think if the guy spend more, you have to keep track what he spent at instead of sort of a one-time lump sum, I give to you this margin, do whatever kind of thing. That's what we had in mind more about the loan size in terms of variables. To me, it's relative natural. I mean, its size as long as it's lower than I kind of doesn't matter really. And you could have other nonlinear way to think about this. So we kind of make it broad and relative sort of really, really detailed sort of micro theory kind. I would say there's a broader way we think about it. In principle, we could try to really do that sort of thing, thinking about the bank and have to kind of do the costly state verification. I think that would be closer to our fixed costs actually. I think to that extent will still work as long as for our purpose, but that may be closer to what Alan had in mind, more heterogeneous, depending on situation, things like that. So that'll be my view, yeah.
All right, thank you.
No, thank you.
Tai-Wei, I also have a brief question.
Yeah, sure.
So, in your model, when you think about the cashless limit, you're thinking of a very specific type of cashless limit where the K goes to zero. But are there potentially different ways of generating a cashless limit? I mean, obviously, one would be where the cost of holding money would go to infinity, but might there be other ones worth thinking about?
Okay. I mean, I think for this question, I think sorry, let me just get a relevant slide so that I can answer. So here's a little layman, right? The claim is that in this world, I mean, potentially you could think about different parameter changing, but if you live in our world, then that's the only way to get cashless limit. That's our claim. I mean, but what does it mean by our world? We mean that the cost of monitoring or the user credit is parameterized by sigma and k. Now we ask, given that's the kind of world we live in, what kind of parameter can make it? So that's what the word. I agree with you that this is not the only model you can write down, whether you can have cashless limit, obviously. But I think our point is more like relative nature, similar to what the existing models are doing. I think we're making a point that really depend on other things. That's sort of main of our point. And the hope is not, we don't want it to be last paper on cashless limit, right? Also, so we're hoping that we kind of more like thought-provoking. You know, here's a way you can do things and we get bunch of results, and there can obviously other ways to think about different angles. Yeah, so that would be my argument. Having said all that, I do feel that there's a sense that the monitoring cost is getting lower. That's why you look at 70s, right? When we start to have credit now, it's quite prevalent. Why is that? I think it's easier now for people to have record, to know who you are, to know what you spend. All that stuff is definitely lower cost. So to us, it's not a crazy theory to think about why this is happening.
Hey, Tai-Wei, I have a more like a question to see if I understood things correctly. My impression is that you're able to get all this nice tractability thing, which is great actually, because I mean, maybe the key assumption is this linear enforcement cost. Because I know a paper by Rocheteau where the cost is convex, and then you get all these banked people, they also use money, money enters in that process as well. I mean, if I'm right about this, have you given thought to how sensitive this thing is or not? I'm right. I mean, you see, suppose you make this sigma guy kind of convex on how much you lend. Now you allow the guy to issue the IOU.
No, so I would say it's not important at all. I think we can handle convex costs, I think, relatively easily. what's important is the new monetary structure that gives us tractability. The thing that once we have that, I don't think this is very important for us. When you look at even the expression, let me go to the expression for getting the contract. You essentially you change this term.
You're still going to get this all banked people do not use any money. You still get that?
Yeah, I think we'll get that. What is true, so let me be slightly more careful. What is true is that when you do private information, linearity helps a lot. So that does help. I think that will make it easier. But no, I don't think this is important for us. We can the linearity in the monetary cost. You're talking about sigma D business, right? Yeah, so right. No, that I don't think is important.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Luis.
Great. Are there any other questions?
Let me just make one final comment. Well, if there is no other question. Tai-Wei, we talked about that. All these like monetary, like cashless limit are kind of driven by the actions of the buyers, right? They decide the portfolios. They decide not to hold any cash.
Yes.
But if you look at the picture, you motivate that. That's really come from the sellers. We don't want to accept cash. There seems to be. I'm just making that comment, right? So that if we take into account the seller acceptance, result could be different.
So I agree to the extent that I think in our model, who's paying the cost? Like one way to think about it is think about the sigma D and K business. To a large extent, actually who pays for it doesn't matter. When we say bank pays it, implicitly also so the bank plus the buyer. That's one way to think about that. What I certainly agree and we abstract away from is the industrial organization detail between, how credit card company deal with merchants and how they split the fees. There's a huge literature on that. We don't have much to say about that. For us, the reason is more about we want to think about liquidity as a main issue here. And for us, it's natural to think about the buyer side. Of course, if you want to really make this, and again, I do think there are many papers to be written later on that you want to talk about that part, which I agree will be important potentially for cash as an outside option. That part we didn't touch, and I do think it's important. There are literature, I think less in the new monetary literature, but there are other literature that deal with all this network business and how credit company split fees with merchants, and those are important too. I agree. We don't touch in that sense.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you.
Okay, well, that was great. Thanks a lot, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Tai-Wei, and good to see everyone. And we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.